Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Tony Palmieri's Media Rants. I am Tony Palmieri. Today's rant is called How Joe Biden Can Unite Factions, the PopeADope Strategy. I hope you enjoy. Now, given that he's running for the presidency in the middle of a global pandemic, depressed economy, and the most widespread racial justice protests since 1968, it's not surprising that Joe Biden's religious background has received limited media attention. Yet if he does prevail in November, Mr. Biden would be only the second Catholic ever to occupy the White House. The first, of course, was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Biden takes his faith seriously, and in 2005 said, "The next Republican that tells me I'm not religious, I'm going to shove my rosary down their throat." Back in the day, anti-Catholic bigotry made it virtually impossible for Catholic candidates to capture the presidency. New York Governor Al Smith, Democratic Party nominee for president in 1928, could not overcome hysterical reactions to his Catholicism in some parts of the country. All over, the Ku Klux Klan campaigned actively for Republican Herbert Hoover. Political historian Alan Lichtman concluded that the religious issue was by far the most important influence on voting. During the 1960 campaign, with anti-Catholicism still salient for a significant block of voters, especially Southern evangelical Protestant Democrats, JFK took the issue on directly in a speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. His emphatic endorsement of the principle of church and state separation became a prototype for how to handle accusations that if elected, the politician would place allegiance to religious principles or leaders above allegiance to the Constitution. JFK said, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be a Catholic, how to act, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source. I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." Given that today 163 Catholics hold seats in the United States Congress and 5 sit on the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, Sonia Sotomayor, and Brett Kavanaugh, it's safe to say that anti-Catholicism by itself is no longer sufficient to block upward mobility for public servants. When a headline-seeking St. Louis Archbishop announced in 2004 that he would not serve communion to pro-choice Catholic Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry, it was the church itself, by then in a well-deserved crisis of legitimacy after decades of shameful child abuse cover-ups and other corruption, that looked foolish and hypocritical. But even though Biden's Catholicism will probably not be the factor that determines his electoral fate in November, it does behoove his campaign to define his relationship to the religion before the Republicans define it for him. There are 51 million Catholic adults in the United States, almost evenly divided between those leaning Democratic and Republican. Conservatives view Catholics as the quote-unquote ultimate swing constituency, and have launched a Catholics for Trump coalition. No doubt GOP operatives salivate at the thought of pegging Joe Biden as just another pro-abortion liberal who's out of touch with the church's patriarchal and puritanical teachings on social issues. In my view, the connection of religion to public policy should not be something that Democrats minimize, get defensive about, or concede to the GOP. For too long, establishment Democrats and more authentic progressives working outside the party have allowed the Republican view of religion to dominate in the public sphere. As a result, too many Americans see religion as connecting with public policy only when we are dealing with marriage rights, abortion, and other culture war issues. We forget that the historical movements for slavery abolition, civil rights, and peace were led almost exclusively by deeply religious activists. Even the movement for prohibition, led by organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, turns out to have been not about anti-alcohol prudery, but about reining in the ability of a corrupt industry to profit through promoting the addiction of working people to booze. So how can Joe Biden be more proactive on the religious issue? Can his Catholicism become something that actually unifies the factions he needs to defeat his hydroxychloroquine hawking opponent? I think it can if Biden and his campaign follow what I call the PopeADope strategy for Catholic candidates. The strategy includes two parts. One, style and tone, and two, progressive economic policy. The first part appears to come easily to Biden, while the second will require some adjustments in positions the campaign has taken, especially on core economic issues. Let's talk about each part. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, the younger Joe Biden struck me as little more than the typical Washington hack politician. He talked much about governing for the middle class, but always found ways to privilege the interests of big corporations and the military-industrial complex. His disastrous and short-lived presidential campaign of 1988, in which he was discovered to have plagiarized material both in law school and in his political career, had a kind of crass ineptitude to it that pretty much became the Biden brand. From his bumbling facilitation of Anita Hill's testimony during the Senate confirmation hearings of Judge Robert Bork, to his championing of the 1994 crime bill that led to mass incarceration, to his support for bankruptcy law so favorable to big banks that it provoked Elizabeth Warren to get into politics, to his enabling of the Bush administration's weapons of mass destruction lies in the run-up to the Iraq War, Joe Biden was hardly what you'd call the conscience of the Democratic Party. Now, Mr. Biden will never escape that record, a record that makes it nearly impossible for key blocks of voters, especially the Bernie Sanders Democrats and progressive-leaning independents, to see him as anything more than the lesser evil candidate. Most Bernie-crats will vote for Biden, but they won't be happy about it, and their activism on his behalf will be minimal. Having said that, we all know a politician's prior record is not necessarily what builds or maintains a base of voters. If it was, we would see a hell of a lot more incumbents booted out of office. Style and tone count at least as much as prior record and current policy proposals, and probably more. For most of his public life, stylistically, Biden performed a scrappy, working-class, average Joe kind of persona. He was chosen for the VP slot in 2008, in part because Barack Obama thought the Biden persona acted as a liaison to the white working class. For me, Biden's never been fully credible when enacting the working class role. And in fact, most of his gaffes occur when he's anchored in that role. Telling an African American radio host that if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black, is only the most recent example. This year, something's different, perhaps because he's trying to establish as sharp a contrast as possible with the hedonistic, narcissistic Trump, or perhaps merely as a result of age. Biden sometimes takes on a kind of papal style that's in stark contrast to his usual average Joe. In the papal style, which is most effective in Biden's scripted speeches and ads, he waxes on about the character of the nation being on the ballot and how we need a comeback for our national soul. At a time when thousands of Americans are dying from a mysterious virus, tens of millions are suddenly unemployed, and social unrest is exploding in the streets, the papal style sets a comfort-providing tone. Pope Joseph I can at least feel our pain, which is something Mr. Trump is clearly not capable of doing. The papal style by itself cannot transform the Bernie-crats or independent progressives into fired-up Biden voters, On the other hand, those factions appreciate politics carried out with a sense of moral urgency. While a papal style and tone may not grow Biden's progressive support, neither will it shrink it. And the style might connect with voters over 65 from all over the political spectrum who see this election as being more about restoring an atmosphere of decency to Washington. Who better to preach decency than a pope? And now for the difficult part. News reports indicate that Biden wants to move left in an effort to unify the Democratic Party going into November. Unfortunately, the alleged moves to the left, such as lowering the Medicare eligibility age to 60 and expanding student debt forgiveness, not only aren't sufficient to spark enthusiasm among the Bernie-crats, but they're also wholly inadequate to the grave crises the country is facing. As an open centrist beholden to corporate power for all of his political career, it's understandable that Biden cannot or will not endorse a democratic socialist platform. On the other hand, the bland, middle-of-the-road, don't rock the boat, nothing would fundamentally change, as he told his rich donors, business as usual, that combined with name recognition and the retreat of the other centrist candidates before Super Tuesday, got him through the primaries, just won't be enough in a general election taking place during an economic collapse probably more severe than the Great Depression. So if current conditions require Biden to move away from centrist crony capitalism and democratic socialism is not an option, well, where does he turn? Well, good Catholic boys should always turn to Catholic social teaching, which since the 1890s has been known for stinging critiques of capital while maintaining comfortable distance from overt socialism. In 1891, during a turbulent time of often violent resistance to capitalist class exploitation of workers, Pope Leo XIII released the encyclical Rerum Novarum, also known as Of Revolutionary Change, or Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor. A foundational text in Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum solidified Leo XIII's standing as the workers' pope because of its clear social justice orientation, especially in calling for fair wages, the right to form unions, and the moral imperative of respecting the dignity and worth of the person in the workplace. How important is that latter point as we now have a president willing to invoke wartime powers to force meatpackers back to work without sufficient protection against the coronavirus? Mr. Biden would do well to remind the voters that not only his own, but all major religious traditions reject the exploitation of the working masses to benefit the privileged few. Rerum Novarum also sparked what in Catholic theology became known as the preferential option for the poor, a principle that found its way into 20th century European social welfare programs and can even be linked to FDR's New Deal, JFK's New Frontier, and LBJ's Great Society. Now, the United States government has spent the better part of the last 40 years moving away from that principle, the consequences of which have now become painfully clear as the pandemic brutally exposes the inability of the government to protect the most vulnerable. In 1981, on the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Pope John Paul II released an updated version called Laborum Exercens, also known as Through Work or On Human Work. In it, he laid out two principles that ought to be accepted by every American politician, regardless of party or religious affiliation. Number one, labor takes precedence over capital. And number two, people are more important than things. If you think about it, the failure of our political system to form policies based on these two simple yet powerful principles is probably at the root of every major problem we face. If and when he is asked about how his Catholicism informs his politics, Pope Joseph Biden I would be doing himself and the country a great service if he would simply say, my religion teaches that labor takes precedence over capital and people are more important than things. I intend to govern from that foundation. Just saying that much, and hopefully saying it sincerely, would make it so much easier for progressive factions to do more than just grudgingly vote for him. Of course, if Biden wants to get really daring, he doesn't have to look backwards to popes of yesteryear. Today's Pope Francis is the most socioeconomically progressive pontiff in history, going as far as to refer to regressive taxation and tax cuts as sinful. He has said repeatedly that the economic system should serve the common good. And in response to the pandemic, Francis has suggested that this may be the right time to enact a universal basic wage. That was, of course, Andrew Yang's signature issue during the pre-pandemic Democratic Party primaries. It's a bold idea, one that Pope Joseph Biden I should give serious consideration to endorsing, as it is now clear that drastic action is necessary to get us through this modern depression. Hey folks, let me conclude by making sure it's clear what I am not arguing in this rant. I am not arguing that Joe Biden should be a vessel for the Vatican. I am not saying he needs to be a mouthpiece for any Catholic policy on the economy or anything else. But what I am arguing is that the Democrats need to stop ceding the religious ground to the Republicans. Biden needs to remind voters about the moral dimensions of all political issues. Too many people in our country think that religion and politics only intersect when we're talking about sexual orientation or abortion or any of the other favored culture war issues of the political right. But in fact, as we know, there's a moral dimension to every political issue, whether we're dealing about healthcare, education, the environment, how to deal with the pandemic, and literally everything under the sun. Now, Joe Biden needs an economic program that walks the morality talk. And what I've pointed out in this rant, I hope clearly, is how there's a long line of Catholic social teaching on the economy that is quite progressive. And for someone like Biden, who like most mainstream politicians in this country, Democrat and Republican both, has been caught up in what I'll call crony capitalism, someone like that is never going to be comfortable endorsing a kind of democratic socialism of a Bernie Sanders. But the Catholic social teaching, the principles that come out of that, especially the ideas that labor takes precedence over capital and that people are more important than things, those can be the basis of a good, progressive, secular economic program that would allow Biden to then stand for the minimum wage as a living wage, fair taxation for the 99%, and numerous other positions that as of yet he really has not adopted. So he does need that program that can walk the morality talk. What I'm calling here the PopeADope Strategy, I think would help unify the Democratic coalition. Because while the Bernie people and other independent progressives are never going to be thrilled with Joe Biden, if he can simply adopt moral, progressive principles on the economy, and some of that, again, comes out of his Catholic background, that would go a long way toward unifying that coalition. I want to thank you all for listening. You can read a text version of this rant at my blog, Tony Palmieri's Media Rants, tpmediarants.blogspot.com. You can also go to my website, tonypalmieri.com. I hope you've enjoyed this. You can leave comments at the end of this video. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, and I hope to talk to you again.